Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Matt here, today doing a simple video on the Leupold Mark IV HD. I say simple because I just turned on the camera so I could talk quickly about this scope. This is not going to be a technical review, just my opinion about it. And the reason why I want to make this video now is because I'm sending this back to Course Group this week. They sent this to me for testing. And in that, there was no obligation of me to do any sort of coverage on this whatsoever. So, they didn't expect me to make this video or anything. But the reason why I wanted to make a video on the Mark IV here is because it's a little bit newer. It just became available this year. And I haven't seen many of them on the firing line yet. So I wanted to do sort of my opinions on this. And a lot of people who follow me know that I've been testing the scope from Course Group for a little bit of time, and I've had a lot of questions about my thoughts on it, especially when it comes to comparing the Mark IV here to the Mark V HD. So I thought I'd do that video for you today. Again, I'm not going to go super technical into the specifications because you can look all that up online. But I just wanted to obviously thank Course Group for sending this to me. Again, there was no sort of expectations of any sort of testing I had to do. They simply sent it to me because I was curious about it. So I really do appreciate that. And earlier on in the season, they had sent me a Mark V HD. So I do have hands-on experience with both of the scopes. Unfortunately, I didn't have them simultaneously, so I never got to use them side by side on the same day. But I have a really good feeling of what I like and what I don't like about each scope. So that said, this scope, the Mark IV here, I've had for about 2 months and I have used it quite a bit. I probably used it in about 3 or 4 rimfire matches, and I used it in a centerfire PRS match as well. So I have had, again, match experience with it, which got me pretty familiar with it pretty quickly, and I had run the Mark V for a couple matches as well. So pretty good comparison I can do between the two, which a lot of people I think are going to be interested in, because the question I get most often is my thoughts between the Mark IV and the Mark V. So when the Mark IV was first announced last year, I was immediately intrigued by it because it retains a lot of the features that I really like from the Mark V HD. And for the price point, I think it's a huge winner. We'll talk about the specific comparisons between the two scopes later. But first off, just talking about the scope Course sent me, they didn't really give me an option in terms of what magnification version I got. So this one here is the 4.5 to 18 by 52. If I personally were to buy a Mark IV HD today, I would be looking at probably the 8 to 32 times magnification, maybe the 6 to 24. We'll talk about why afterwards. But just like the Mark V HD, the Mark IV HD is a full lineup of scopes with several different magnification models to choose from and some different reticles as well. So this one here, being the 4.5 to 18, is a little bit of a lower magnification range than I would personally choose myself for my PRS style shooting. Although, like I mentioned before, I was able to use it pretty successfully, and the centerfire match I shot with it went out to just over 1,100 yards. And even though I would regularly use more magnification than what the scope could provide me, it was still fine for what it was. So anyway, talking about the features here, as you would expect, the overall quality of this from Leupold is quite nice. It's very nice. This is a solid mid-tier scope, and the price reflects that. It's just around the $1,500 US mark or thereabouts. In Canada, it's more like $2,300 or so, depending on which model and reticle you choose. But all the controls on it, if you have felt a Mark V or you shoot a Mark V, are going to feel very, very similar to you. And one thing that I really like is that they used a more common 34 mil body tube size for the Mark IV, whereas the Mark V uses the somewhat obscure 35 mil body tube, which to me is a downside because unless you shoot a Mark V, you probably don't have 35 mil rings or a scope mount. So that's a substantial cost that is added to the price of getting a Mark V, because you need a way to mount it, obviously. So the Mark IV, again, 34 mil tube, which I personally like a lot. But besides that, everything is very similar. The diopter adjustment is nice and smooth. Magnification ring has a good feel to it. It might be a tad stiff, but it's nowhere near as bad as some other scopes I have, especially from Vortex. Vortex sometimes, especially they're actually have one right here. The Venom here, like, oh man, this thing is super stiff. So that's kind of annoying to have to change on the clock. But the Mark IV feels really nice. The turrets on here are very reminiscent of the Mark V, and I really like the Mark V turrets. So both the Mark IV and the Mark V turrets are a big win for me. They have the button lock, which I'll show in more detail in a second, but they've taken this turret system and also put it on the windage. So the windage dial also has this locking button now, which again, I'm a fan of. The Mark V I tested had a capped windage turret, and I prefer this this button lock style, again similar to the elevation turret on the Mark IV. And the parallax adjustment here, also very nice and smooth, doesn't take much effort to adjust it, which again is great. So all the controls on the Mark IV are really good and they feel great. I want to talk a little bit more about the turrets now. When I had the Mark V for testing from Korth Group, I didn't make any content on it. I didn't make any videos or anything because it's a very well-known scope, but the Mark IV being a little bit newer, I want to make this video, so now I have a chance to talk about these Leupold turrets. I'll tell you right now, these turrets on the Mark IV and the Mark V are among some of my favorites I have ever tried. They feel great, and this little lock button is something that takes maybe a little bit of getting used to, but in the end I do like the feature a lot. If you're not familiar with how these work, I will demonstrate this. So essentially you have this button that is a zero stop as well. So when you're on your zero, you're going to have the turret locked. To adjust the turret, you need to depress this lock and then you can dial up or down. So going down from your zero stop, you have 0.5 mil of travel underneath your zero, which is perfect. That's what I like to have in my turrets anyway. When you go back to zero, again, it will always lock. Depress the button to dial up as normal. Once you've gone past your zero stop, you don't need to depress the button anymore, and it also becomes your rev indicator, which is quite neat. So if I dial up here and I approach 10 mils or full revolution, you'll see this locking button will actually become flush with the turret to denote that you have gone 1 revolution into your elevation adjustment. Really cool. It's a nice obvious visual cue as well as a tactile cue that you're in a revolution upwards. And if you have enough elevation to go into the 3rd rotation, that button will actually be sort of sucked inwards into the turret. So now there's actually like a little socket or a little hole in your turret. And again, it's a very obvious visual cue as well as a tactile cue as well. So that's really awesome. And let's see, so I almost have, well, that's 28.7 mils of upwards adjustment, and this scope was last used on my centerfire rifle with a 20 MOA base zeroed for 100 yards. So 28.7 mils up is pretty darn good. Again, zeroed on my centerfire rifle. So you can see here, when I go back to the 2nd revolution, it'll become flush, and then the 1st revolution, it will pop back out. And then when you get back to your zero stop, it will lock in place. I really like that a lot. Furthermore, these turrets also feel really good. So the zero stop and the rev indicator is something I like, but also just the feeling of the Mark IV and the Mark V turrets are among some of the best that I have personally felt. What I like about them is they don't take too much effort to actually spin the turret, and the tension in the turret itself is very well balanced with the harshness of the clicks, which means it's very controllable. Even if you turn this really fast, you can still feel every individual click, and it's very easy to control single click inputs. It's a very controllable dial, and it works very, very nicely. So I really like this elevation turret. It's easy to use. It's easy to use quickly under stress, and it's just one of the best ones I've ever felt, to be totally honest. So I really like that. And again, as I mentioned, the windage turret on the Mark IV here has the same zero lock. So you do have to depress it to turn. It will lock in your zeroed setting, but obviously it doesn't have the same amount of rotations as your elevation turret. pretty sweet. Another sort of like secondary bonus feature of this lock system with the button that I found is slipping your turret to 0 is really easy. So the Mark IV and the Mark V uses little set screws, which generally I don't love on scopes because they can be kind of annoying. However, because of this zero stop system, this makes it a lot less cumbersome. So let me demonstrate why. Let's say I'm going to just pick an arbitrary setting. Let's say I need to zero my rifle and it's, you know, in this setting. So I need to slip my turret back to 0. There are 2 set screws that I'm going to loosen. I'm doing this behind the camera, so it's a little bit awkward, but I'm going to loosen those set screws here. Loosen those up. And now the turret, well, you can actually just take it right off there, but it's free spinning as well. And when you slip your turret back to 0, because of the button lock, it actually holds it in place, which is a big benefit because you don't have to worry about your turret slipping out of 0 as you're tightening these little grub screws, which is a common issue with these turret systems that use the small grub screws. But as I tighten these set screws back up, again, the turret just holds its place because of that zero stop button, which makes slipping the turret back to 0 a lot less cumbersome than on other scopes that use these set screws. So you can see there, it's right on 0. Obviously it didn't slip because it's locked right there, and it automatically sets your zero stop to have 0.5 MRAD under your 0, which is perfect, and it's just as easy as that. I really like that a lot. So that was sort of like a secondary bonus feature. Just makes slipping your turret back to 0 really easy. I think I've talked about how much I like these turrets enough now, but you can get a sense of how much I like them. I really like those turrets a lot. So big win for both the Mark IV and the Mark V. Slight difference between the two though is the Mark IV is a 10 MRAD turret, so 10 milliradians per revolution, which is my preference generally speaking. I think it's just easier to do the math that way. The Mark V HD, the one I tested was a 5 to 25. I believe they're all the same for the high magnification models, but it was actually a 10.5 mil per revolution turret, which is kind of weird. So the markings for your second and third rev indicator are sort of offset on the Mark V, whereas on the Mark IV it's a more sort of like simple 10 MRAD per turret. Really easy to do the math on that, and they just work great. I didn't have any issues in terms of legibility of the turret under stress. The lines seemed to line up well enough where I was never misreading the dial at all. So I don't have any issues with that as well. Glass quality was good. I would say most people who are shooting in what I would consider like a normal lighting situation in either the sun or maybe like a slightly cloudy day will not notice any sort of downside to this glass. As I mentioned before, I was making shots at the center fire match out to 1100 yards, just a little bit beyond that, and I was able to see everything I needed to make good corrections on my follow-up shots. So the glass really is quite good. It is a little bit of an inferior glass compared to the Mark V HD, at least from what I can remember, but you're not giving up much at all. And for the price point especially, it's a very high-performing scope, and it gives you most, if not all, the features you would need in a PRS scope. The only thing it's missing for some people might be illumination, but the Mark V also doesn't have illumination for the PR2 reticle, which is the most common PRS style reticle that Leupold makes, in my opinion. And this one here, by the way, is the PR2 reticle in this Mark IV as well, and the 5 to 25 Mark V that I was testing also had the PR2 reticle. I will say a big reason why I personally don't compete with Leupolds is because of the PR2 reticle. It just doesn't get along with me, which is completely subjective because some of the best PRS shooters use Leupolds with PR2 reticles. So obviously it's something that you can train and get used to, but me coming from a Razor and the EBR 7 series of reticles, I'm just really used to reading that very quickly, and it's almost like second nature to me reading that reticle now. So I'm very used to the 0.2 MRAD markings in the Vortex EBR reticles, whereas the PR2 quarters the MRAD. So there's a half marking and then like a quarter mil marking as well, which I get the concept. I know how to use it. I'm just a little bit slower on it. The line thickness, I'll tell you a quick story. I thought the line thickness in the PR2 reticles were really thin. And so I just looked online quickly to see what the line thickness was, and I was very surprised to actually find out it's listed to be the same line thickness as what is in my Vortex Razor EBR reticle at 0.03 mrad. And I think the reason why I thought that this had a much finer line thickness is because when you look at the reticle, to me it looks a lot less bold and apparent, but I think it's just because there's more gaps in the PR2 reticle and the numbers aren't quite as large as in the EBR reticle and the Vortex. So that's the reason why I thought it had a thinner line thickness, but funny enough, it actually is the same. However, just because it's the same, I found that the PR2 reticle in these Mark IVs and the Mark V, for me, again personally, would get washed out in a busy backdrop a lot easier. So especially like berms that are the mulch, like wood mulch berms and things like that, the PR2 reticle for me was really hard to read quickly because it would sort of get washed out in the backdrop, where the EBR reticle would retain its legibility a little bit easier for me. So that was another issue I noticed right away. But the line thickness, again, is the same, and I looked at the scope side by side, the Mark V at the time and the Razor, and sure enough, the line thickness is the same. They're just very different reticles. So use what works for you. The Mark IV, we'll talk about this later, but the Mark IV doesn't come in as many reticle options as the Mark V, but the PR2 is the most popular that Leupold makes for PRS style shooting, at least as far as I'm aware of. And so it's nice that they offer both the Mark IV and the Mark V with the PR2. All right, let's go on to the big question that everyone wants to know, is how the Mark IV HD compares to the Mark V HD. Again, my opinion, but I think if you can find a Mark IV HD model that works for you, it's really enticing and almost makes the Mark V a non-factor, because this is such a good price point and it's so feature packed with some really great features, and you're saving close to, again, depending on what models you're comparing, but you're saving close to $1,000 going from a Mark V to a Mark IV. But of course you are giving up some stuff. Optically, the Mark IV is slightly inferior to the Mark V, and more importantly, you're having to choose compromises, in my opinion, when you're looking at a Mark IV model. Let me explain further what I mean by that. So because I'm going to be throwing around a lot of model numbers, I've written down the 5 that I want to talk about. These are not the full product lines of the Mark IV or the Mark V, but these are the ones I think most PRS style shooters would be looking at in terms of the magnification range and objective lens size. So the first 3 at the top here, listed under the Mark IV. Again, the 4.5 to 18, which is the one I have here on the table. If I were to buy a Mark IV, it would probably be one of these, the next two, either the 6 to 24 by 52 millimeter objective lens, or the 8 to 32 by 56 millimeter objective lens. The reason why I'm really emphasizing the objective lens size is because me personally, I would want a larger objective lens at the 56 mil. However, you can see that they only offer the Mark IV with the 56 mil objective lens in the 8 to 32 version. I'm going to come back to that. The Mark V HD, both the models that you would probably be looking at for PRS use, the 5 to 25 and the 7 to 35, both come in a 56 mil objective lens. And that's important to me because with a bigger objective lens, you're getting a wider field of view, which makes a lot of things easier, both being more aware of your target surroundings as well as target acquisition is greatly helped with the larger field of view, and I would prefer a 56 mil objective lens. So then the question is obviously, well, why don't you just get the 8 to 32? You know, it's an easy decision. Just get the 8 to 32 by 56 Mark IV. You're saving $1,000 over the Mark V, and you're getting the 56 mil objective lens. Well, because there are compromises that you have to make with the Mark IV. And what are those compromises? It's going to be internal elevation. I don't know if this was a conscious decision by Leupold. Maybe it was just convenient, but maybe it's the optical system in the scope or whatnot. The Mark IV 8 to 32 by 56, which again is what I would want, that model only has a measly 20 mrad of internal elevation in the scope, which is really not much. If you drop down from the 56 mil to the 52 mil options, again, the 6 to 24 or the 4.5 to 18, the one on the table here, it is significantly higher. The internal elevation adjustment in these two models is going to be, I believe it's 35 or 36 mils in this one here, the 4.5 to 18, and 30 mils in the 6 to 24. So it is a huge amount more than the 8 to 32, 50% more at least, which is a big factor for a lot of people. Again, that's what I meant by you had to sort of make compromises. If that works for you, if you only need 20 mRad of elevation and you have a scope base where you can retain most of the upwards elevation travel, then the 8 to 32 would be completely fine. Going on to the Mark V HD, both these versions have at least 30 mils of internal elevation, so there's really no compromises. You just choose the magnification range that works better for you. You get a 56 mil objective lens and a lot of internal elevation. So that's why I say you need to make sure that the Mark IV specs are going to work for you. If you know for sure you need a 56 mil objective lens, but you know you want more than 20 mRad of internal elevation, well, you would actually have to bump up to the Mark V HDs. So hopefully that was, I know that was a lot of numbers I just threw at you, but that's essentially the compromises you're making when you choose a Mark IV model. You have to make sure that the specs work for you. And I think that's the reason why the Mark V HDs are still going to be an option for a lot of people. Also keep in mind the Mark Vs come in many more reticle options than the Mark IV. The Mark IV only have a handful. It is nice again that they kept the PR2 available in the Mark IV because that's going to be probably the most popular for PRS style shooting. But the Mark Vs have the Horus reticles and the tremors and things like that. So obviously a little bit more of a premium product. The Mark V, you don't really have to make the compromises of internal elevation and objective lens size. But they also come with the 35 mil body tube, which a lot of people don't have mounts for. So you have to budget that in additional cost if you're bumping up to a Mark V coming from any sort of like quote unquote normal scope with a 34 mil tube. Another thing that I think is kind of strange about both the Mark IVs and the Mark Vs is there's no illuminated reticle option for the PR2 reticle. There are illuminated reticles for different models in the lineup with different reticles and such, but I think it's really strange that there's no PR2 illuminated, because illumination is something, I wouldn't say I use it frequently, but it's not uncommon for me to turn on illumination for obviously night matches. You would want it, but even for a lot of rimfire matches are shot in the woods and they have like a woods portion of the course of fire, so I'll turn on the illumination for that, which is a great benefit. Or if it's just a really dim day, it's super overcast, it's nice to have the illumination. So I think that is a glaring feature that's missing in either the Mark IV or the Mark V with the PR2 reticle, but besides that, both are great scopes. So in a nutshell, the Mark IV is an awesome scope. It's a very high performing scope, especially considering the price and whether or not it's worth paying more money. Again, about $1,000 US to get the Mark V is going to be totally up to the end user and their needs, depending on how you shoot, what you need out of your equipment, and what you're looking for, basically. But anyway, that was my quick, I don't think it's been quick actually, but that was my video on the Mark IV HD. I hope it was helpful. Again, I want to thank Korth for sending this to me. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. I'll do my best to answer them. If not, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Cheers.